My name is Alexis, and the night my marriage truly ended was supposed to be a celebration. Our 10th anniversary. A milestone. A decade of love, of sacrifice, of compromise. But instead of candlelight and champagne, I found myself standing in the parking lot of a roadside bar, the neon sign buzzing overhead, watching the taillights of my husband's car vanish into the night. "Have fun alone!" he shouted, leaning out the window as his friends roared with laughter. His voice slurred by whiskey sliced through the cool air. Then the car sped away, the laughter fading into the distance, leaving me with nothing but silence dust and the sinking realization that I was 400 miles from home and utterly alone. For a moment, I couldn't move. I stood there frozen, clutching my small handbag like it was a life raft. My mouth hung open mid-protest to the words unsaid, because what good would they do now? My heart pounded so hard I could hear the rush of blood in my ears, louder than the jukebox music drifting out from the bar. I turned slowly as if expecting to see them circle back, but the road was empty. "This is just a joke," I whispered, though the knot in my stomach told me otherwise. He had pulled stunts before disappearing during parties, embarrassing me with cruel jokes. But this, leaving me stranded in a town whose name I couldn't even pronounce 4 states away from the safety of my own home, that was something else entirely. The evening had started innocently enough. We'd planned a weekend getaway with some of his old college buddies. I had wanted something more romantic, a quiet cabin, a nice dinner, but he insisted, saying, "They're like family. We'll celebrate together." From the start, it had been tense. Too much drinking at lunch, too many sideways remarks when I suggested slowing down. I remember Pete, one of his closest friends, slapping him on the back and sneering, "Man, she's always trying to control you." The others laughed, and I felt the heat rise to my cheeks. I excused myself, stepping outside into the cooling evening air, hoping he'd follow with an apology. Instead, he came out with his words sharp, his anger precise despite the alcohol. "You always ruin things," he muttered, shoving the car keys into his pocket. "Always nagging. Always making me the bad guy." "Because you were drinking too much," I snapped back. "Because you're about to drive us into a ditch." His jaw clenched. He turned, walked toward the car where his friends waited, and for a moment I thought he was just going to sulk inside, maybe slam the door for effect. But then he looked back at me, eyes glittering in the glow of the parking lot lights, and smirked. "Your purse has your wallet right. You'll figure it out. You're smart. Always telling me what to do." The door slammed, the engine revved, tires screeched, and then gone. I stood there trembling, my breath coming in short gasps. A couple sitting outside the bar on rickety metal chairs turned their heads, watching with mild curiosity. The woman whispered something to her partner, who gave me a look of pity before turning back to his beer. My humiliation burned hotter than my fear. I didn't want to cry in front of strangers. I pulled my phone from my bag, my hands shaking. I dialed his number once, twice, 27 times. Straight to voicemail every single time. I typed out desperate messages. "Please come back. This isn't funny. Where are you?" The blue check marks showed they were delivered, but no replies came. When I tried calling Pete, then Marco, then every one of the men who had been in that car, my calls failed. Blocked. My stomach dropped. This wasn't a spur-of-the-moment prank. This was planned. A humiliation. The streetlights flickered on, casting long shadows across the cracked pavement. My thin blouse did nothing against the chill, and I crossed my arms tightly, trying to hold myself together. I had $80 in cash. My credit cards were in his wallet. He'd offered to carry them earlier, claiming my purse was too full. And now I was 400 miles from Boston, without transportation, without a plan, without a husband. I walked slowly toward the bar, hoping maybe one of his friends had stayed behind. Maybe it wasn't as cruel as it seemed. But the parking lot was empty, except for a beat-up pickup truck and a rusty motorcycle. Inside, the bar smelled of fried food and stale beer. Men in trucker caps hunched over the counter nursing drinks. A jukebox hummed some old country song. Miss You, okay. The bartender, a middle-aged woman with streaks of gray in her hair, wiped her hands on a towel and looked at me with cautious eyes. I forced a shaky smile. My husband just left. I need somewhere to stay for the night. She studied me for a moment, then pointed across the street. There's a motel. Not much, but it's clean. Cash only. I nodded, murmuring thanks. My legs felt heavy as I crossed to the motel, each step echoing in my ears like the tolling of a bell. The neon vacancy sign buzzed, half its letters burned out, casting a sickly red glow over the cracked asphalt lot. Inside, the manager, an elderly man with thick glasses, slid a registration card toward me without question. 45 a night, he said. My hands trembled as I peeled off nearly half of my remaining money. The room was dingy, a narrow bed, a chipped dresser, a faded painting of a ship on the wall. A faint smell of mildew clung to the curtains. I set my bag on the chair and sat on the bed, the springs creaking beneath me. Only then did the tears come. Silent at first, then choking sobs that shook my whole body. How had it come to this? 10 years of marriage, 10 years of being the supportive wife, smoothing over his temper, making excuses for his outbursts. I had given up so much: my career in design, my independence, to build a life that revolved around him. And now, on the very night we were supposed to celebrate us, he had driven away laughing, leaving me behind like discarded luggage. I curled up on the bed, clutching my pillow, my phone still in my hand. I refreshed the screen, hoping for a message. Nothing. Just silence. The glow of the streetlight bled through the thin curtains, painting a pale rectangle on the carpet. That was the night my marriage ended. Not with a fight, not with divorce papers, but with the sound of tires screeching and laughter fading into the dark. And though I didn't know it then, it was also the night my new life began. I didn't sleep much that night. The thin mattress creaked every time I shifted, and the musty smell of damp carpet clung to the back of my throat. But it wasn't the room that kept me awake. It was the silence. The silence of a phone that never buzzed, a door that never opened, a man who never came back. By dawn, I gave up on pretending to rest. My eyes burned from crying, and my head ached with the weight of unanswered questions. I sat on the edge of the bed, staring at the weak sunlight filtering through the thin motel curtains. The world outside kept moving, but I was stuck in the pause he had forced upon me. I checked my phone again. Nothing. No apology. No explanation. No "where are you?" The 27 calls from last night glared at me like accusations. He'd seen them. He'd chosen not to answer. My stomach growled, reminding me I hadn't eaten since lunch the day before. I grabbed my bag and stepped outside. The morning air was cool, the sky painted in pale streaks of pink and gray. Across the street, the diner's neon sign flickered, its hum audible in the quiet. I crossed quickly, my shoes crunching on gravel, and pushed the heavy glass door open. Inside, the diner smelled of coffee and bacon grease. A few early risers sat scattered among the booths. 2 truckers in faded ball caps, an older couple sharing a crossword puzzle, a young waitress leaning against the counter. She looked up when I entered, her tired smile polite but curious. "Sit anywhere you like," she said, her southern drawl gentle. I slid into a booth by the window, the vinyl seat sticking to the back of my legs. A laminated menu leaned against the sugar dispenser. My eyes scanned the prices, my brain calculating what I could afford. $80 minus 45 for the room left me 35. Enough for a day, maybe 2 if I stretched it. The waitress appeared with a pad and pencil. "Coffee." "Yes, please," I said, my voice hoarse. She poured from the pot she carried, the steam curling in the air. I wrapped my hands around the warm ceramic mug like it might anchor me to the earth. "You traveling?" she asked casually, pen hovering. I hesitated. Sort of. "Heading east or west?" I forced a small smile. "I'm not sure yet." She studied me for a moment, then nodded without pressing. "Well, the pancakes are good. And cheap. You want a stack? I nodded, grateful. When she left, I stared out the window at the parking lot. A pickup truck pulled in, its engine rattling, and a man in dusty jeans climbed out. Normal life unfolded around me, people on their way to work, travelers passing through, locals settling into routines. Meanwhile, I was a ghost. A woman left behind. The pancakes arrived stacked high, golden and steaming, with a small pat of butter melting on top. I ate slowly, savoring each bite, not because I was hungry, though I was, but because I didn't know when I'd eat again. The waitress refilled my coffee twice without asking. By the time I paid my bill and stepped outside, the sun was climbing higher, warming the asphalt. I had no plan. My phone still offered no answers. I thought about calling my parents, but the thought of explaining what had happened, of hearing the disappointment in my mother's voice, made my chest tighten. They had never approved of Gabriel. They had warned me more than once that his temper, his arrogance, his jokes weren't harmless. And I had defended him. I had insisted they didn't understand. Now I'd have to admit they'd been right. Instead, I wandered the small town. The streets were lined with brick buildings, some with peeling paint, others boarded up. A thrift store, a hardware shop, a barber shop with a striped pole that spun lazily. The sidewalks were nearly empty, the only sound the occasional rumble of a truck passing by. I walked into the thrift store, pretending to browse. The air smelled faintly of mothballs and old leather. Racks of worn clothing stretched in rows, bins of books sat stacked near the register. I fingered the sleeve of a denim jacket, thinking absurdly that I might need it if the nights grew colder. But I set it back. I couldn't afford to spend what little I had on comfort. By mid-afternoon, the heat pressed down heavy and my feet ached from wandering. I returned to the motel, collapsing onto the bed. My phone buzzed once and my heart leapt, only to see it was a bank notification. My checking account balance mocked me, a few $100s left, but no access to it without my cards. Gabriel had those. And if I called the bank to report them stolen, he'd know exactly where I was. I curled onto my side, staring at the faded wallpaper. How had I become so powerless once I'd been confident, ambitious? I dreamed of building a design firm, of traveling, of creating a life that was mine. But somewhere along the way, I'd shrunk myself to fit inside his shadow. And now, abandoned in this small town, I realized how small I had become. That evening, I returned to the diner, ordering only a cup of soup and a slice of bread. The waitress gave me a knowing look, but didn't comment. When she refilled my coffee, she leaned closer. "You got folks you can call?" I hesitated. "Not really." She nodded, her eyes softening. "Then don't you worry. Folks get left behind all the time out here. You'll figure it out." Her words meant as comfort stung. Left behind all the time, as if it was normal, as if I was just another nameless woman in a long line of broken promises. But as I walked back to the motel under the dim streetlights, something shifted in me. I realized I could stand there forever waiting for him to come back, or I could decide that he wasn't coming, and maybe that was the best thing that could have happened. The night air was still carrying the faint scent of fried food and diesel. My shoes scraped the pavement as I walked, each step a reminder that I was moving forward, however slowly. By the time I reached my room, I wasn't thinking about whether he would call. I was thinking about what I would do next. I didn't know yet, but I knew one thing with certainty: I would not beg him to return. The next morning, I folded the motel's thin blanket as if neat corners could make order out of chaos. I counted my cash again, $35 and some coins, and felt the weight of what those bills meant. Not very much time. I stood at the window watching a truck idle in the lot, exhaust puffing in lazy clouds. Somewhere out there, 400 miles away, sat the house with the glass front cabinets I'd installed, and the framed anniversary photos lined up like proof of a story that wasn't true. I dressed in yesterday's clothes, smoothed my hair into a low ponytail, and made a decision. I wouldn't call Gabriel. I wouldn't call my parents either, not yet. Pride has a taste to it, metallic and stubborn. I chose to swallow it with a glass of motel tap water and walk out the door. At the diner, the same waitress her name tag said, Darla lifted her chin in a greeting that felt like a small kindness. Morning, Han. Morning, I said. Do you know anyone hiring anything? I'm a fast learner. She glanced down the counter toward a boy wiping ketchup from a menu with the enthusiasm of a funeral. We could use someone who knows up from down during lunch rush, she said. Owner's in back. You want me to ask? My yes came out too quick. She disappeared through the swinging door and returned with a compact woman in a flour-dusted apron. The woman scanned me as if reading fine print no one else could see. You ever serve? She asked. Not officially, I admitted. But I directed events, parties, managed vendors. I can carry 6 champagne flutes at a time and talk a millionaire into using cloth napkins. The corner of her mouth twitched. Well, Miss Cloth Napkins, it's $8.50 an hour plus tips. Cash out at the end of the day. We're short a hand. You got shoes that won't kill you? I looked down at my flats. They'll do. Name's Rita, she said, already turning. Apron's on the hook. Keep coffee filled. Don't let Frank complain about his eggs. He likes complaining more than eggs. You make it through lunch, we'll talk about dinner. I slipped behind the counter as if I'd always belonged, tied on an apron that smelled faintly of onions and bleach, and stepped into a rhythm my body somehow knew: smile, listen, refill, move. The grill snapped and hissed. The ticket bell dinged. A toddler banged a spoon like a tiny drummer. It felt good to do something that had a start and a finish: pour a cup, clear a plate, hand someone a slice of pie, and watch them soften around the edges. The last time I'd felt that kind of easy competence had been years ago in a showroom full of swatches and sunlight when clients trusted my eye. I tucked that memory away like a talisman. During a lull, Darla leaned against the counter beside me. Where you from, Lexi? She asked, trying on a nickname the way you try on a scarf. Boston, I said. Lord, she exhaled, you are far from home. I nodded. The truth sat between us like a third person. We made it through lunch, then dinner. My feet throbbed like I'd been walking over pebbles in thin-soled shoes, but when Rita counted out cash at the end of the night and slid a small pile my way, the pain eased. It wasn't much. It was everything. Room paid, she asked, not looking up. For one more night, I said. She chewed on that, then scribbled something on a scrap of paper. Take this to Earl, 2 blocks over the hardware store. He's got an upstairs unit he lets my cousins use sometimes. It's no palace, but it's cheap and safe. Tell him I sent you and you'll pay weekly. I blinked too fast and pretended it was the fluorescent lights. Thank you. Don't thank me, she said, flipping the open sign to closed. Just show up on time. Earl was a man made of angles, square jaw, squared shoulders, squared shelves behind him. He read Rita's note and gave me a tour of a room that was honest about its flaws: scuffed floors, a faint smell of pine sol, a window that stuck halfway. But the lock worked, and the roof held, and when I lay on the mattress that first night, I cried again. Less from terror, more from relief. I had a door. I had a key. I had a tomorrow. Days threaded themselves into a rope I could hold. I worked breakfasts and lunches at the diner, sometimes dinners when a server called off. In between, I swept Earl's shop for $20 and the right to use his back office computer for job searches. I pawned my wedding band at a shop with dusty velvet trays and a proprietor who spoke gently when he told me the number. I didn't argue. I took the cash and walked out into sunlight I didn't feel. On the 3rd week, the soles of my flats surrendered. Darla fished a pair of black sneakers from her trunk, her daughter's a size too big. I stuffed the toes with tissue and said they fit just fine. She grinned and said, "Now you look like a diner girl." Between refilling coffee and balancing plates up my arm, I listened to the regulars. Old-timers argued politics with more heat than the grill. Young couples split pancakes and futures. A widow in a crisp cardigan ate the same chicken salad every Wednesday at noon and left $1 under her saucer like a secret. I learned names. I remembered no onions and extra pickles, and that Frank only wanted to send back his eggs if I looked like I might cry. So I learned not to look like that. Some nights I took the long way home past the thrift store window where a dress shimmered under dust and fluorescent light. It was a silly thing blue with tiny white flowers. I imagined wearing it somewhere that wasn't sticky with syrup. Then I went upstairs and soaked my feet in a bowl steam curling like ghosts. On Sundays when the diner slowed, I asked Rita if I could rework the chalkboard menu. She lifted a brow. "You draw too." "I design," I said, my voice catching around the verb. "Or I used to." "Then design me a grilled cheese that sells itself," she said, and pushed a squeaky box of chalk across the counter. I sketched a stack of bread and ooze, added little stars and a price, and watched an old man point his cane at it. "That looks like it'd heal a person," he declared, and ordered two. Rita smirked. "Looks like you just paid for your break." That night, I lay awake with a stubborn thrill under my ribs. It was a small thing, a chalkboard and a sandwich. But it was mine. Somewhere around week 5, a call came from an unknown number. I let it go to voicemail, then pressed the phone to my ear and listened to the past speak in casually cruel tones. Alexis Gabriel's voice drawled, "This is ridiculous. You're making me look like an idiot. Come home. We'll talk." I stared at the ceiling and felt nothing I expected. No rush of hope, no collapse of resolve. Just a cool, clean anger. I didn't call back. I didn't delete it either. I let it sit there like a specimen on a slide. 2 days later, he texted, "Where are you? Then are you done being dramatic?" Then nothing. I changed my number. Earl had a nephew who could make magic happen with a phone plan, and for a crisp 20, I became a little harder to find. In the mirror over the bathroom sink, a different woman stared back. Not prettier, not younger, but steadier. The soft places of my life, places Gabriel had pressed his thumb to, were hardening into something like bone. Yet loneliness is a patient thing. It waits under the kitchen sink with the old sponges and crawls out when the house goes quiet. It came for me when I folded my one good towel. It came at the grocery when the cashier asked if I needed bags and I wanted to say, "No, I need someone to ask how my day was." It came on a Tuesday when a storm rattled the windows and I realized I had no one to call to say listen to the rain with me. One wet afternoon, the widow from Wednesdays stopped me at the diner door. "You're new," she said, "but you look like you know things." Sometimes I said, "Do you know where to get good curtains? They tell you the truth about a room, you know. Not like men." She dabbed at her lipstick with a finger. "Men tell you what you want to hear. Curtains just either hang right, or they don't." "I can help," I said before I thought better. "I used to be an interior designer." Her eyes brightened. "Come see my living room after your shift." I sat in her parlor that evening while the storm ticked at her windows, measuring with Earl's metal tape and sketching with the stub of a pencil. She insisted on paying me. I insisted she didn't. We compromised. She fed me roast chicken and gave me a check with my name spelled wrong. I pressed the paper into my pocket and tasted something I hadn't in a long while, usefulness that wasn't tied to a man's needs. Word got around the way good gossip does, sideways smiling. 2 more women called, each with a room that didn't feel like itself anymore. I helped them choose paint and rods and fabric that didn't pretend to be anything it wasn't. I charged less than I should have and delivered more than they expected, and when I fell asleep those nights, the loneliness didn't find me as quickly. On a quiet Thursday, Earl leaned on his counter and studied me. "You staying or passing through?" he asked. "I don't know," I said honestly. He nodded like I'd said the right thing. Sometimes not knowing is how you start really knowing. I laughed. "That sounds like a sign you'd paint on reclaimed wood and sell for $40. He shrugged. "Might hang it in the window." I walked back to the diner with rain on my shoulders and the feeling that the ground under me, while still new and tender, might hold. I didn't go back to him. I didn't even look in the direction of that life. Instead, I bought a small corkboard from the dollar aisle and tacked up 3 index cards: rent, food, future. Every night, I pinned a receipt under one. Every morning, I added a new card: me. Some days, it just meant 5 minutes of quiet with coffee and the sun on my wrist. Some days, it meant drawing a room that didn't exist yet and believing it someday would. I was still that woman left in a parking lot, yes, but I was also becoming the woman who walked away from it. By the end of that first summer, the little town had begun to feel less like a trap and more like a cocoon. My shifts at the diner gave me rhythm, the upstairs room above Earl's shop gave me safety, and the odd jobs helping women redo their curtains or choose paint gave me back something I hadn't realized I'd lost: my voice. Still, every day I woke with the same quiet dread. This can't last forever. I needed more than cash tips and borrowed sneakers. I needed a life that was mine. One evening, as I wiped down a table at the diner, Rita slid into the booth across from me. She held a folded newspaper, the ink smudged on her apron. "Community college up in the city's starting a fall session," she said casually. "Design program. You ever think about picking that back up?" The words made my chest tighten. Design. The word felt like a door opening, one I'd closed years ago. "I don't have the money," I said automatically. Rita shrugged. "They've got grants. Work study. You're not the first woman to start over." I stared at the ad she pushed across the table. The letters swam a little in the fluorescent light. For the first time in months, my pulse quickened, not from fear, but from possibility. That night in my upstairs room, I filled out the application online using Earl's dusty office computer. My hands trembled as I typed out my history, work experience, the portfolio I hadn't touched in years, the degree I never finished. I expected rejection. But 2 weeks later, an envelope arrived. Inside was a letter with the words, "Congratulations, you've been accepted." Commuting to the city wasn't easy. I took a bus at dawn, the vinyl seats sticking to my legs in summer and freezing me in winter. I balanced textbooks on my knees, reading under the flicker of overhead lights. By afternoon, I'd rush back from my diner shift, smelling of diesel and determination. At first, I felt ancient among the students with their smooth faces and quick thumbs. I was in my 30s, older than most of them by more than a decade. But I knew something they didn't: what it felt like to have everything stripped away. I worked harder. I listened closer. I stayed after class asking questions until the professors recognized me by name. Slowly, confidence returned. I remembered how colors spoke to me, how spaces could be shaped to cradle or elevate, how a well-placed chair could turn a room from hostile to welcoming. Each project felt like brushing the dust off a part of myself I'd buried. Money was tight. I pawned the last of my jewelry, skipped meals, and learned the cheapest routes on the bus system. Darla sometimes slipped me leftovers wrapped in foil, pretending it was an accident. Earl refused to raise my rent even when I insisted. "Pay me when you're rich and famous," he said gruffly, polishing the same wrench for the third time. There were nights I broke down exhausted, doubting everything. But in those moments, I'd look at the corkboard where my 4 cards hung: rent, food, future, me, and remember why I kept going. As the semesters rolled by, my world widened. A professor encouraged me to submit one of my designs to a regional competition. I laughed at the idea but entered anyway. When I won 3rd place, standing on that stage under hot lights, I felt taller than I had in years. People noticed. A local realtor asked if I'd stage a house. A boutique owner asked if I'd redesign her window display. The small jobs added up, each one a stitch in the fabric of the new life I was sewing. With every project, I grew bolder. I learned to say, "Yes, I can do that," even when fear whispered otherwise. And when the jobs were done, I realized I hadn't lied. I really could do it. I started a portfolio, printing photos of before and after shots, taping them carefully into a binder. The binder felt like a promise, a future I could carry under my arm. Meanwhile, the town itself began to shift around me. The widow who had first asked for curtains now invited me for tea on Thursdays. The young couple whose nursery I painted sent me a Christmas card. The diner regulars started greeting me by name, sliding into booths with smiles that made me feel less like a stranger and more like a neighbor. One afternoon, I walked down Main Street and realized I wasn't scanning every corner for an escape. I was scanning for opportunities: what empty building might make a studio, what shop needed a fresh coat of paint. It was then that the idea took root: maybe I could open something of my own. Not big, not flashy, just a small design studio where I could meet clients, sketch ideas, and maybe make a name for myself. The thought scared me, but it also thrilled me. The years passed quickly, measured not in anniversaries anymore, but in semesters, projects, and milestones of independence. My body changed too. I was stronger from lugging fabric samples and climbing ladders. My face had more lines, yes, but they were lines carved by laughter with friends who didn't abandon me. One crisp fall evening, I stood outside a newly painted storefront. The glass gleamed, reflecting the town's modest skyline. Above the door hung a sign I'd saved for months to afford a Lexus interiors. The key turned in the lock with a satisfying click. Inside, the space smelled of fresh paint and possibility. My portfolio sat on the desk. My first official business cards lay stacked in a neat pile. I ran my fingers over the embossed letters, the ink still smelling faintly metallic. I thought of that night years ago, standing in a parking lot, clutching $80 and a heart full of despair. I thought of the car speeding away, leaving me behind, and I smiled. Because I hadn't just survived. I'd built something new, something better. It wasn't all triumph, of course. There were setbacks, months where work dried up, nights when the loneliness crept in again. But the difference now was that I had tools. I had a studio. I had a community. I had myself. And perhaps most surprisingly of all, I had room in my heart again. It started slowly, almost imperceptibly. A man came into the diner one morning while I was sketching ideas on a napkin. He asked about the drawing, genuinely curious. He came back the next week, then again. His name was Michael. He was gentle where Gabriel had been sharp, patient where Gabriel had been quick to anger. He didn't try to own me, he tried to know me. I didn't trust it at first. But over time, the trust built itself brick by brick, until one day I realized the walls I'd built around myself weren't prisons anymore. They were foundations. And with him, I wasn't the woman who had been left. I was the woman who had chosen. Michael first walked into my life at 8:07 on a Tuesday morning. The time is burned into memory because the diner clock above the pie case ticked with such stubborn insistence I couldn't pretend I wasn't late for my shift. He took the corner stool, ordered black coffee and whole wheat toast, and asked what I was sketching on a napkin. Window display, I said, flipping the paper over as if my ideas were secrets. In those days, they were. For that boutique on Main, he asked, nodding toward the street. He had a contractor's way of looking: quick assessment, then gentle respect. They've got good bones in there. The light's wrong. You'll fix it. He spoke like the future was a thing you could set on a workbench, sand smooth and oil until it glowed. I brought him his toast. He left a tip big enough to notice and small enough not to embarrass me. Then he returned 2 days later and sat in the same stool like he'd never left. Over months, we accumulated a string of ordinary moments. Coffee refills, small talk about weather that turned into talk about work, that turned into talk about the lives that work made possible. He ran a small millwork shop on the edge of town. Michael and Son, started by his father, continued by him alone, after his boy moved to Denver to design furniture, and his marriage ended with quiet sadness rather than shouts. He showed me photos of cabinets that looked like they were born in place of crown molding, so seamless it felt like a sentence finished in the exact right word. We moved slowly because I asked us to. He never reached for my hand before I'd reached for his. He never touched the lock on my studio door without asking if I wanted it open. One windy afternoon, he stopped by Alexis Interiors with a paper bag. "The window's sticking," he said. "You've been hip-checking it like a hockey player. Let me tune it." He pulled a small battered toolkit from under his arm, well-loved not showy, and adjusted the sash cords with quick, sure motions. The window lifted with the sigh of a thing relieved to be itself again. "Put it on my invoice," I said. He smiled. "Consider it a neighborly intervention. But if you insist, I'll take payment in the form of letting me buy you lunch." I looked at him for a long moment at the laugh lines that didn't come from cruelty at the hands with sawdust still ghosting the knuckles. "Okay," I said. We ate soup at the deli and split a cherry tart. He walked me back to the studio without trying to translate it into anything it wasn't. Trust, when it came, didn't arrive like a parade. It crept in through the everyday, the way he checked the smoke detector at my place, without making a show of it, the way he asked about my classes and remembered due dates. I'd forgotten the way he respected the boundary line called my finances and never tried to cross. If my car made a rattling sound, he offered to recommend a mechanic but never took my keys. If I had a big job, he offered an extra pair of sawhorses and the use of his truck, then watched me load it myself. There were moments when the past tried to drown me anyway. A group of men laughing too loud in a parking lot could turn my blood to ice. The anniversary date circled on calendars could make my throat close. Once at a hardware store, a man with Gabriel's cologne brushed past, and the smell sent me back to a neon-lit lot with gravel under my shoes and humiliation in my mouth. I stepped outside and sat on the curb until the panic ebbed. When Michael found me there, he didn't crowd me with questions or fixes. He sat beside me and said, "I'm here, and if you want quiet, I can be quiet." Later, he asked if I'd ever talked to someone about what happened. I said, "You mean a therapist?" He nodded. "I'll drive you. I'll wait in the truck. I'll bring you a milkshake after." I laughed because milkshakes have a way of puncturing the self-serious bubble that trauma blows around you. I made the appointment. He kept his word about the truck and the shake. As I finished school and took on larger projects, our lives began to braid in small, respectful ways. The community center wanted a lobby that didn't feel like a leftover broom closet. I sketched benches curved like a welcome, and Michael built them with wood from a fallen maple the town had loved since before anyone could say why. When we installed them, a veteran ran his hand along the grain and said, "Feels like home." We looked at each other and didn't have to say out loud that this was why we did what we did. On Sundays, we cooked in my tiny kitchen. He chopped onions with domestic reverence. I stirred chili until the room smelled like warmth. Sometimes we danced barefoot to an old song on the radio, the kind my mother would hum while dusting the mantel. When he kissed me for the first time, it wasn't fireworks. It was a turning toward a quiet consent to be seen. He never asked for more than I could give. When I said I wasn't ready to share a drawer, he bought me a small toolbox and put it under my sink with a note inside. For the stubborn window days. When I said I wanted to grow my business without anyone thinking I'd found an easy ladder to the next rung, he said, "Then I'll stand at the bottom and make sure the ladder's steady. You climb." We went to his mother's porch on warm nights. Maureen told stories in that Irish way that starts in one place and ends in another, but somehow stitches the journey together. She pressed my hands and called me "lovely girl" in a tone that made me believe it. He came to the widow's house with me once to hang rods I couldn't manage alone. He charged her nothing and left a potted geranium on the stoop without a note. The town stitched us into its mending. The pastor asked if I'd speak at a women's breakfast about starting over. Michael sat in the back and grinned like I was reading a poem he loved. Earl pretended he didn't cry when I gave him a framed photo of the first storefront he'd rented to me with the caption, "Thank you for the roof." Darla taught Michael how to pull an espresso because a man should know how to not make his woman drink diner sludge forever. He learned. We laughed. I kept my studio. I kept my name. He kept his shop and his rituals. Some nights we went home to our own beds because solitude is also a kind of love. Some nights we fell asleep on my sofa watching an old movie where everyone wore hats and said things like they meant them. Money got easier. I raised my rates to numbers that didn't apologize. Michael bid on bigger jobs and won them without swagger. We paid things off slowly. We gave small gifts generously. We made a habit of buying the first pie of the season for the firehouse and the last pie of the season for the librarian who pretended not to like pecan and always took a second slice. When winter came with its teeth, we put plastic over the studio windows together, our breath puffing little clouds. He wrote his name backward on the fogged glass, and I laughed like I hadn't in years. In spring, when the plastic came down and the light fell clean across the floor, I signed papers securing a modest line of credit for the business. The banker shook my hand like he meant it. I walked outside and cried simply because no one had co-signed, no one had hovered, no one had asked if my husband approved. We talked about marriage with the practicality of people who'd been burned and learned. He said he'd marry me in a courthouse or a cornfield, or not at all if I preferred. I said I wasn't ready yet, but I was ready for forever in smaller, surer steps. And he said, me too. Years gathered quietly. My studio wall filled with framed photos of projects and handwritten notes from clients. His shop smelled constantly of cedar and resolve. We built a table together one June planned until it felt like river water under the palm. We ate our dinners at that table, crossing off small victories in a notebook we kept in the center labeled "Good Things We Might Forget." I didn't forget the past, but it stopped walking into rooms ahead of me, introducing me by my wounds. When I thought about Gabriel at all, I felt a kind of distant pity for a man who mistook ridicule for power. My life had become soft in the right places and strong in the others. And I thought foolishly maybe that the story with him had ended in that parking lot with taillights and the shout of "Have fun alone." I could not have known that years later at a restaurant, miles from that neon sign, our paths would cross again, and that the look on his face when he saw who sat beside me would be a punctuation mark I didn't know the sentence needed. The restaurant was new to me at least. A modern Italian place in the city with iron light fixtures dangling like softened chains, music low enough that conversations felt confidential. Michael had suggested it after I signed my biggest contract yet, redesigning the lobby of a historic hotel that wanted both grandeur and comfort. "We'll celebrate," he'd said. "You pick the wine, I'll pick the pasta." I wore the blue dress from the thrift store, the one with tiny white flowers I used to stare at in the window, but hadn't dared buy until years later when my own money made the decision mine. My hair was looser than usual, my makeup simple, but intentional. Michael looked at me across the table with that quiet pride of his, the kind that didn't need words. Halfway through the meal, rigatoni with fennel sausage for him, grilled salmon for me. The waiter uncorked a bottle of red we'd splurged on. Michael raised his glass. "To building a life," he said, his hand brushing mine. "One choice at a time." The clink of glass was still ringing when I heard it, a laugh. Familiar. Sharp. A sound that made my stomach seize before my mind caught up. I froze, fork midair, as my body remembered before my memory did. Then I turned my head. And there he was, Gabriel. Older, yes. Thinner hair, deeper lines bracketing his mouth. But still with that cultivated air of superiority, tailored blazer wristwatch gleaming under the lights. He stood at the host stand with two other men, their postures deferential as though orbiting a planet. He laughed again at something one of them said, and the laugh cut through the years like a blade. I wanted to vanish, to melt into the leather seat to become steam off the pasta. But the host led him down the aisle closer, and then like some cruel cosmic choreography to the table, directly across from ours. He sat. He didn't look around right away. He was too busy telling a story with expansive gestures, his companions chuckling dutifully. Then, mid-sentence, his eyes wandered. They landed on me. Time stopped. Recognition dawned slow like a match catching, then roared into shock. His mouth stilled. His hand froze around his wineglass. And then the smile. The practiced, disarming smile he used on clients and waiters and women he wanted to charm. It spread across his face, but it never reached his eyes. I didn't smile back. Michael followed my gaze, his fork pausing over his plate. "You know him?" he asked softly. My pulse pounded so hard I thought the wineglass might rattle in my hand. "That's my husband," I whispered. Then, correcting myself with deliberate weight, "my ex-husband." Michael's brows lifted slightly. He looked at Gabriel, then back at me, then simply reached across the table and covered my hand with his. The steadiness of that touch was an anchor in a sea suddenly churning. Gabriel rose from his seat. My chest tightened. He strode over, leaving his companions blinking after him. "Alexis," he said, voice slick with rehearsed warmth. "My God, after all these years." I couldn't move, couldn't breathe. All I could see was gravel neon, the back of a car speeding away while his friends laughed. Michael's thumb brushed the back of my hand. Present, present, not then, now. Gabriel's eyes flicked to him, lingering on the way Michael's hand covered mine. Something in his expression cracked the smile, faltering the charm, wobbling. "And this must be—" Gabriel gestured vaguely. "This is Michael," I said, my voice steadier than I felt. "My partner." The word hung in the air like a banner. Michael inclined his head in polite acknowledgement. No challenge, no puffed chest. Just quiet presence. Gabriel blinked. His practiced composure wavered. I saw the exact moment it hit him, the realization that I was not alone, not waiting, not broken in some corner of the world. I was here whole, sitting in a blue dress across from a man who loved me without needing to own me. He tried again. "You look, well," he said, as if the years hadn't happened, as if his leaving had been a misplaced set of keys instead of a deliberate cruelty. "I've wondered about you. Tried to find you even." I But I shook my head. "You don't get to rewrite the story, Gabriel." The words surprised me, but once they were out, they tasted right. His smile cracked further. "Alexis." "No," I said, my voice rising firm. "You left me. You abandoned me. On our anniversary. You laughed while I stood there with nothing. You thought I'd crumble. But look at me, Gabriel." I gestured around to Michael, to the life etched in my every line. "I didn't just survive. I built something better. Without you." His face flushed, a storm of pride and disbelief, and something like regret warring across it. He glanced at Michael again, at the calm strength radiating from him, and for once, Gabriel had no words. Michael, still holding my hand, spoke then, quietly. "We were just finishing dinner, if you'll excuse us." The dismissal was gentle, but final. Gabriel stood there, another heartbeat, then nodded stiffly and returned to his table. His friends looked at him, puzzled, whispering behind their menus. His shoulders sagged in a way I'd never seen. I turned back to Michael, my body trembling as the adrenaline drained. Tears pricked hot behind my eyes. "You did perfect," he murmured. "I didn't plan that," I said, half laughing, half crying. "You didn't have to," he replied. "You just told the truth." I exhaled long and shaky. For the first time in years, the weight I carried shifted, not gone, but lighter. Gabriel's shadow had been long. But here in this restaurant, under these warm lights, I realized shadows only exist where there is light strong enough to cast them. We finished our wine. Michael told a ridiculous joke about fennel seeds. I laughed genuinely as Gabriel sat silent across the aisle. When we left, stepping into the cool night air, the city hummed around us like a promise. I slipped my arm through Michael's. the blue dress brushing my legs, my heart beating steady. Behind us, Gabriel remained in his chair, staring at a life he had abandoned, and a woman who no longer belonged to him. When Michael and I stepped into the night, the city air carried the faint smell of roasted chestnuts and rain on pavement. Streetlights threw golden halos onto slick asphalt. I leaned into him, the warmth of his arm steady against my ribs, and felt my breath even out for the first time since Gabriel's laugh had pierced the restaurant air. We walked without rushing. The hum of traffic and the chatter of passers-by wrapped around us like a soundtrack that didn't belong to Gabriel or the past or the grief that once defined me. It belonged to the present, to me. At the corner, Michael squeezed my hand. "You okay?" I let the question settle before answering. "Yes," I said. And I meant it not in the automatic way people say it to deflect concern, but in the deep bone way that comes when you realize a wound has finally scarred over. Back home, I slipped off the blue dress and hung it carefully. I ran my fingers across the fabric, remembering the first time I saw it in the thrift store window, how far away it felt, then a symbol of the woman I wished I could be. Tonight, I had worn it not as an aspiration but as armor, and it had carried me through. I poured a glass of water, sat at my desk, and opened the notebook Michael and I kept, the one labeled, "Good Things We Might Forget." I wrote, "Saw Gabriel, he saw me, and he saw that I'm free." Closing the cover felt like closing a chapter. Not erasing it, the ink remained the truth of it, permanent, but containing it in a place where it could no longer leak into everything else. The next weeks were ordinary in all the best ways. I worked on the hotel project, spreading swatches across my studio floor until color and texture hummed in harmony. Michael planed a set of doors until the grain gleamed. We ate dinner at the table we'd built together, sometimes in silence, sometimes laughing until wine nearly spilled. But something inside me had shifted. Gabriel's face at that restaurant, his smile freezing, his charm cracking, had been a mirror. For years, I'd carried the fear that maybe he was right, that I was dramatic, dependent, incapable without him. Seeing him see me successful, partnered, alive, proved how false those fears were. I realized then that closure doesn't always come with an apology. Sometimes closure is the look on someone's face when they realize you thrived without their permission. One Saturday, the widow Margaret invited me and Michael for tea. Her living room, once draped in curtains that dragged like tired eyelids, now breathed with light. She poured Earl Grey into cups that had seen decades and said, "Do you know what I admire most about you, Alexis? Not that you rebuilt, but that you allowed yourself to love again. That's the real courage." Her words landed deep. Because she was right, it would have been easy to stay walled off, safe, but small. Loving Michael hadn't erased the pain of Gabriel's betrayal, but it had transformed it like compost, turning rot into nourishment. Sometimes I still think of that night in the parking lot. The neon buzzing overhead, the crunch of gravel under his tires, the taste of humiliation in my mouth. I think of how convinced Gabriel was that leaving me would teach me a lesson. And I suppose he was right. I did learn a lesson. Just not the one he intended. I learned that being left behind doesn't mean you are less. I learned that independence is not a punishment, but a gift. I learned that kindness offered by strangers, by friends, by myself, is stronger than cruelty. And I learned that sometimes the cruelest act is the catalyst for the most beautiful rebirth. A year after the restaurant, Michael and I took a trip not far, just to a coastal town with clapboard houses and a pier that smelled of salt and fried dough. One evening, as the sun dropped molten into the sea, he asked, "Do you ever think about marriage again?" I watched the horizon, steady and endless. "Yes," I said. "But not because I need it. Because I want it." He nodded, his hand warm in mine. "That's all I'll ever ask." We didn't rush it. But we talked about it more openly, weaving the idea into our plans like thread through fabric. And for the first time in my life, marriage didn't feel like a cage. It felt like a choice. Looking back, the distance between the woman I was and the woman I am feels like the span between stars, immeasurable yet made of small steps. One bus ride, one diner shift, one cheap apartment key, one class at a time, one sketch on a napkin, one act of trust. And then one night at a restaurant, one frozen smile that confirmed everything I already knew. I was free. If you've listened this far, maybe you've lived your own version of being left behind. Maybe someone you trusted drove away laughing, thinking you'd crumble. Maybe you've stood in your own parking lot of despair, counting the few bills left in your pocket. If so, hear me, their leaving is not your ending. It can be the start. You are capable of more than survival. You are capable of building, of choosing, of loving again on your terms. So if this story touched you, I invite you to share it, to subscribe, to join me in a space where we honor resilience, and remember that betrayal is never the final word. The final word belongs to us. And mine tonight is simple: I never went back.